There you go. Okay, take it away, Jim.
Can everybody hear me who's on Zoom? Okay. Well, let me start with a couple of definitions that I'm working with so that we're all on the same page. You can take them or leave them, by the way. You'll see books with the title Gnosticism on there. Well, that term was invented in the 17th century by a scholar who was reading many of the church fathers and thought there was a religion called Gnosticism, which was competing with Christianity. So the term became a kind of collective term for these groups the church fathers were opposed to. The problem is there was never a religion called Gnosticism. It just never existed. So the using the category is like asking you the question, what's your religion? Well, I'm a Protestant. Well, what does that tell you? Almost nothing, except you don't accept the authority of the Bishop of Rome. But outside of that, it could be all over the map. So Gnosticism is a term that's used, but it really doesn't refer to anything specifically. Now, the people in the second century and perhaps in the first century did call themselves Gnostic. The Greek word is gnosis. And they meant by gnosis what we're going to be looking at in this class, something different from what became orthodoxy. I hope you'll let me do something. Orthodoxy doesn't show up till the 4th century, really. But people who were in the 2nd century took positions that became Orthodox. So I'm going to list two groups, the groups calling themselves Gnostics and the groups that were Orthodox. So we'll use those terms just so we have some understanding of what we're doing. So we'll look at what they meant by gnosis in a little while, but I want to get some other terms out. I titled this class on Gnostic spirituality. The word spirituality is another one of those words. How many of you have heard, I'm spiritual but not religious? I don't know what that means, to be honest with you, but let me try something out from my own perspective. Somebody who's really spiritual, I assume, is somebody who's asking the question, who am I? What's my purpose in life? Is there a God or some force in the universe that I should be communicating with in some way? How do I live with other people? What is it? What are we about in this thing? Is there a problem of evil in the world, and why? Spiritual is a way of wrestling with big questions, and not necessarily rationally, but emotionally, imaginatively, and rationally, and try to make some sense out of it. Now, religion's purpose is to come in and help provide structure and order and ritual to inculcate in you the evidence of continuing to ask those questions and help you celebrate those questions. The problem with spirituality without religion is it doesn't go anywhere. Some of the people who call themselves spiritual do, for example, get into meditation. They go into nature and like beauty. So they're acting out in some fashion their spirituality. That's a religious activity. Religion isn't necessarily what happens in synagogues and churches and temples and so forth. It's acting things out. When religion and spirituality work together, religion helps you continue to wrestle with those questions. The problem for religion has been historically, it tends to think it has the answer to all those questions, and you should stop thinking about them. It just learn what we tell you. And then the church ends up perpetuating its own existence, and it ceases to help you wrestle with those big questions. On the other side, spirituality can wrestle with the big question, not act them out, and goes nowhere. So at at its best, spirituality and religion have to go together. And if they break down, religion breaks down with its own substance, spirituality can break down with nothingness, then it goes nowhere. So what I'm looking at, what are the big questions that the Gnostics were up to? But we won't end with that because they're going to try to figure out how to carry it out. That is, they're going to create churches too. The Gnostics really didn't call themselves Gnostic. They claimed to have gnosis, but they called themselves Christians. So we're dealing with, in the 2nd century, a whole bunch of different types of Christianity that existed. We're only looking at one, the ones who claim to have gnosis. But there were others. The eastern side of Christianity was different from the western side of Christianity. And so you have different points of view about who God is, who Jesus is, how it all works, what sacraments. All of those were wildly discussed in the 2nd century by different points of view. And again, it's not until the 4th century when Constantine becomes emperor and forces the church to create unity that you get something what we now call orthodoxy. So part of the discussion in the 2nd century is so interesting because of the really lively time of Christianity trying to wrestle with what it's all about. And fortunately, those questions are still alive. So I hope in looking at Gnosticism, in spite of their wild mythological claims, that there's something there that we can all tune into. Let me stop. I don't know if any of that made any sense to anybody. But do you understand? Yeah.
I missed what you said, the definition of gnosis.
Gnosis is the Greek word for knowledge.
Knowledge. So they claim to
But we haven't claimed,
knowledge.
but we haven't figured out what yet they meant by it. So let's go at that one.
Okay. Thanks.
Jim, another question.
Well, mine's probably way off the topic, but does the term agnostic come based
Yes,
from this basis?
yes.
So then those are people without any knowledge?
No, it means that A is a primitive and it can mean unknown, but I'm not claiming to know one way or the other. There could be or there couldn't be. I just haven't made it. I have no information that I can make a decision on.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Well, our understanding of what the Gnostics believed was determined for years by the writings of their opponents. Because in the 4th century, when Orthodoxy came in, they systematically destroyed the documents that anybody wrote that they didn't approve of. So much of our material about them is what others said about them. And when you only can read the people that don't agree with you, you probably aren't getting the straight story. So the big one that everybody uses is a book written by Irenaeus in about the year 185, and it was entitled Refutation or Overthrow of Falsely Called Gnosis. He called those people heretics. Now, technically, the Greek term heresy means schools of thought. So he was really saying is there's a group of people who have schools of thought, which for Irenaeus were false schools of thought. So it went from schools of thought to false teaching to people who are no longer telling you the truth and they're dangerous and must be stopped. So it went down the line like that kind of thing. So far as I know, the first real conflict between the groups is in the letter of 1 Timothy. I happen to think 1 Timothy is a 2nd century document written by somebody who used the name of Paul. It was standard to use somebody to give authority to your work. And in that, some would put it in the 1st century. It doesn't matter to me. What I'm interested in is what it says in chapter 6, verse 20. So let me read you what it says. The author writing to Timothy, Timothy, protect what has been given to you in trust. Remember that line. Avoid godless and pointless discussions and the contradictory claims of so-called gnosis. When some people adopted this false gnosis, they missed the goal of faith. Okay, that's the loading of the two issues on the two sides of the arguments here. It's gnosis on the one side and faith or pistis on the other. Those are the two contrary terms. And the content of faith is what he says, stay loyal to what was handed down to you. The group that became Orthodox argued that what we have is continuity. Jesus hands it to the disciples hand it to their pupils, the pupils hand it to their pupils. So there's continuity all the way from Jesus to what those who claim to have faith is what was handed down to them, and it's the content. Faith then is a matter of, as it is in Timothy and others, accepting the authority of the bishops, accepting what they tell you is the truth, accepting what scriptures they say are worth reading, accepting what doctrines or creeds they think are valuable, and so forth. So faith is accepting a certain kind of content, okay? If you lose your faith, it means you don't buy that content anymore, and you got to figure out how to recover it again. So faith is content, and it's the content that's handed down from the past, and that's it. The Gnostics don't buy that. They say salvation isn't based on faith. Salvation is based upon a direct personal encounter with God. That's what gnosis is. To have knowledge is not rational thought. It's not something you learn in the university or colleges or schools. It's something you experience. It's an encounter with the reality of God. And if you have that encounter reality of God, you can say, what do I need a bishop for? What do I need to tell me what creeds I'm supposed to believe? Why do they have to tell me the way I have to read some text? You can understand that bishops didn't like this. This was anti-authoritarianism or it's right. But there's a contrast then between faith as a kind of content and Christianity as a kind of experience. And if you have the experience, it out-trumps everything else. And that was the problem. The church was building structures based on bishops and deacons and so forth. And the Gnostic people were trying to inculcate a kind of experience and then build off the experience. So there was clearly a debate going on between the two groups about what is Christianity, what is it all about, and how do we live it out? That was part of this whole discussion. Well, that was one of the debates. The other thing that was a debate was about the nature of the world and how it comes about. Let's start with what they agreed on. Both those who were Orthodox and Gnostic said the world we live in is a mess. They didn't need too much explanation for that one. How did it get to the point where people are killing people? They don't care for people. Wild beasts are killing us. Diseases are attacking us. How did all this happen? Well, the Orthodox position goes back to Genesis and says, when Adam and Eve disobeyed God, they issued into the world by their disobedience a power called sin. So sin is released in the world. And what sin causes is death. So death comes into the world because the power of sin now affects not only human existence, it affects natures and animals, it affects the whole cosmos. So how do you go about correcting this power? Even though humans put it into place, humans don't have the capacity to stop it. It takes an act of God to stop this. Consequently, Jesus is sent to the world to defeat death. And the cross and the resurrection are the defeat of death and open up a new avenue for people who get forgiveness from the power of sin and can be taken on into a new life. That's the Orthodox solution to the problems that they saw. Well, the Gnostics aren't quite thrilled by this. They're saying, wait a minute. Are you trying to tell me that a couple of human beings disagreeing with God for a minute unleashed the whole problem of the universe at stake? This doesn't make it, that's giving humans a lot more power than they should be given. That doesn't make any sense. Based on some others, remember, much of this material is coming out of Alexandria, Egypt, and Rome, and other places where there's a lot of other religions besides Christianity there. And they're saying, wait a minute, what we recognize, whoever made this world made a mistake. The person who made it couldn't have made it a great world for us to live in. There's something wrong, and it's not based on humans. The fall and the creation goes back to whoever made all of this. So the Gnostics say the God of Genesis, who says this whole world is good, is wrong. That's not the real God. And the God of the Jewish text, he gets mad, he has a flood, he wipes people out, he creates vengeance and destroys people. He's an angry God who claims he's the only God there is in the world. That God is not compatible with a God of love and compassion taught by Jesus. So the Gnostics say, we think Jesus was right, and we think these other images of God are wrong. Consequently, the Gnostics say the God you find in the old Jewish text is not God. And yet, that may be the God who created the universe. So now they're struggling with who created the world if that God didn't? And if the world isn't created good and orderly like Genesis claims, then what is the stake? And this is where the Gnostics then start developing this complex mythology. If you start reading the Gnostic text, by the way, they're all, this is what's fun. When this collection of material, which is entitled the Nag Hammadi, because that's the city where it was found, this collection of material was buried in the sands of Egypt. And that was probably the library of a Christian community. But when they started eliminating all the text, they buried them probably to save them. Well, by accident, they were found in the 1940s. And eventually people figured out what they were, and then they all got translated, and here they are collected. Well, now for the first time, we have the writings that they themselves wrote. So we know their point of view, rather than what others, their opponents, were saying about them. So we, in studying these texts, we began to figure out what were they saying? What was their understanding of spirituality and religion? And what was going on in the 2nd century that all this debate was going on? Well, in looking for a creation story, one of the places they turned to was Plato. In the Timaeus, Plato speculates that the world was created by what he called a demiurge or craftsman. And the craftsman had ideal images and patterns to work with and tried to create copies of them, but copies are copies and not the real thing. Plus the fact he was dealing with matter, and matter was resisting wanting to be controlled. So the demiurge does the best he can to create the world, but the world has its own problems. And so you have a mixture of the values of the craftsman and the problems of the world that wouldn't cooperate. So you have a mixed bag, but nevertheless, there's a lot of patterns of the universe being created. So that was one story. Then you have the Egyptian creation story, in which the gods generate out of themselves life and humans and so forth. They're generated out of the problems of the gods. You have that kind of story. Well, you have the Pythagoreans saying all of life is a mixture of male and female, and you can't have life without mixing the two. So to have a strictly male God doesn't make any sense either. So all of these other kinds of issues are coming up, and they're beginning to try to piece them together with stuff that they find in text. Especially, they were very interested in the writings of Paul, that is the Gnostics were, and in the creation story in the opening of the Gospel of John. So let's remind ourselves of some of this. Get me out of here. In the Gospel of John's creation story, one of the things about the Gnostic group is they were biblical scholars. They just didn't read it the same way that the Orthodox group did. They were the first group ever to write commentaries. Heraclian wrote a commentary on the Gospel of John. So they were very much trying to wrestle with this stuff and try to make sense out of it, much more than the Orthodox do until much later. In any case, look at the opening of Genesis. In the beginning was the Logos, or Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Notice that what you're seeing, there's two realities there. There's God and there's Logos. There's two. All right, the Gnostics say, well, wait a minute. God is, and then it says, everything comes into being and nothing came into being without the Logos. God doesn't create the world in John. The Logos does. Well, that tips off the Gnostic group saying, well, wait a minute. Any significant Christian story, which is what John is wrestling with, would say, well, there's a God on the one hand, and there's something that's the origin of all things, but there's at least two there. So they read further, what has come into being was life, and the life was the light of people. The light shines in the darkness. Well, suddenly they start looking at these terms, life, truth, hope, faith, and suddenly these are no longer just words, they're realities. They're divine realities. They have existence. They're part of the ideal realm, the realm that even Plato thought about. They exist in this ideal realm. So how did they get there? Well, their first assumption is the true God that's back behind all of this is a God that's ultimately unknowable. He's so deep, so profound, so complex that not even the others in heaven can understand him. But they are generated out of him. And I should watch my language here because it's not just a him. Bethos, which means depth, was the masculine side, but you can't have just a masculine deity, it won't produce anything. So the other side is either enoia, which means thought, or sige, which means silence. So the true God is both male and female, combining together depth and thought. And that is the original origin of all things. Let me read. This is not a Valentinian. That's a wrong book. I'll never find anything there. In the secret, one of the texts in here is called the Secret Gospel of John. And in it, this text is wrestling with what is God like? And we're not going to go through the whole thing, but this is the description of it. That one is inimitable, since it is nothing before it to limit it, unfathomable, since there is nothing before it to fathom it, immeasurable, since there was nothing before it to measure it, invisible, since nothing has seen it, eternal, since it exists eternally, unutterable, since nothing could comprehend to utter it, unnameable, since there is nothing before it to give it a name. So that's this depth of of insight that's coming about. And it's in wrestling with that depth, which is both masculine and feminine. They then say the two of them, the masculine and feminine, generate out of themselves other elements that are part of heaven. It comes from John's gospel. They produce the logos. They produce truth, masculine and feminine. In Greek, they're masculine and feminine terms. That's why they're put together. They produce life and the beginning or begotten one, the only begotten one. They produce out of that the perfect image of what human is. And they create the perfect image of the assembly called the church. So they took church out of the tradition and turned these into perfect images. And it's these images that make up what is also in the Gospel of John. John's prologue says, out of the fullness we have all received. Well, the word fullness is pleroma. So the word for these heavenly beings is the pleroma. That's the fullness that they are in. I don't have a drawing, but let me give you an idea. The original God, the depth and thought, masculine and feminine, is in one circle. Then there's a limit there because people can't get past the limit to understand the fullness of God. So then there's another circle around this. And you have the others who are generated out, and they create others, 10 out of one and 12 out of another. And so you end up with 30 beings making up the fullness of the pleroma. And then that's a circle around that, okay? I'll just read you a few of the terms that they say. What is created is profound, ageless, self-generated, immovable, only begotten, faith, hope, love, understanding, blessedness, and wisdom. So you can see they're taking all these terms, but again, they're not just words for them. The Gnostics see these as realities. And these are the perfect realities that exist within the fullness of the pleroma. If you read this stuff, it sounds crazy, but you see what they're up to. On the one hand, they want to protect the original God from contamination with the world. The world would contaminate that God. And yet everything that exists must come from that reality. So far, they've created the perfect world, the pleroma. Now we're going to have to get to the creation.
So it sounds like all the terms that were used were all positive terms.
Yes, this is the positive realm of the place. This is heaven, if you will. This is the perfect realm.
Okay.
And everything up there, they all cooperated, and the word ecclesia, church, means they all formed a united, healthy community and all working together. That's the ideal church, if you will. Okay, well, now the story gets going. The last of the divine, well, they're called eons, which means age in Hebrew, but their eons are substantive realities. The last one that comes into being is Sophia, wisdom. Okay, now this is where they go. They read Proverbs. And in Proverbs chapter 8, you get Lady Wisdom who exists with God in the creation story. So wisdom has to be part of the creation story, clearly. And yet also in chapter 9, there's another foolish wisdom, which the Gnostics see as another aspect of wisdom. So there's both the good side and the negative side. That they read out of the book of Proverbs. Okay, what is the nature of wisdom? Wisdom wants to know everything. So she's sitting in the pleroma saying, we ought to know what God's like. After all, we're all out of product out of him. So I'm going to go figure out what God is. Well, of course, she leaves her male side behind and just becomes the feminine side. And she can't get past the limit. So she gets frustrated. She gets angry. She gets sad. And that creates a disturbance in the playroom. That the perfect community is now disturbed. They say, enough of this. If you don't stop this, you can't be with us anymore. Well, she's unreconcilable. So they put her on the other side. They kick her out of the playroom. Okay. Now she's out there and she knows she's made a terrible mistake. And she wants to get back there. So she asks for forgiveness and she goes through repentance and so forth. So eventually she'll go back in. But there's a split. There's another part of her that started this process in it. So another part of her stays outside the playroom. And she creates a son who is Christ or Jesus, and he doesn't want to be outside the playroom. He goes into the playroom. So he's there, but he leaves a shadow behind. And out of the shadow, Sophia creates a demiurge, a creator, who's going to now, he thinks he's really the God. There isn't any other God but him. And he knows the truth. So he's the one that makes the world. And he tries to pattern it on what he thinks is the pleroma, but he's mistaking thinking. And it's like in Isaiah, I am the only God, there is none beside me. That's the boast of this God. So he creates the world. And he's not the ultimate understanding, knowledgeable God. So he makes the world with a lot of mistakes in it and claims it's all good. Well, on the other side of the shadow, that's also there, is created a devil. And the devil then begins to get into the world as well. So the product of evil. So the fall, the problems of the world, and by the way, it's called a kenoa in the Gnostics called the world a kenoa rather than a pleroma. The world is kenoa, and that means emptiness. So the world created is an emptiness. That's the problem with it. It's all messed up. So the problems with what people are wrestling with is a creation that's made not by the most intelligent being there is, which is God or the Logos in the pleroma. Everything emerges from them. Even this demiurge ultimately comes out of the divine realm, but makes the mistake of thinking it's it. And doesn't understand all the mistakes he makes in creating the world. So the problem isn't Adam and Eve. The problem is the false notion of God that people think is God. But let's go back and read good old Genesis again and see how the Gnostics read this. All right. I'm going to go back to the story about Adam and Eve. Okay. In chapter 2 of Genesis, the garden is made, they fill it up. Adam is made, Eve is made out of Adam. And he gives them the opportunity of saying they could eat of everything in the garden except the tree of knowledge and the tree of life. The Gnostics say, what kind of a God is it that doesn't want you to have gnosis or knowledge? What's wrong with eating with a tree of knowledge? That's the whole point. It's to have that experience. Why would some God do that? Obviously, that God can't be the compassionate Father of Jesus. It's a God who's trying to control and strangle human life and keep them from experiencing the true God. That can't be the right thing. Well, who helps them in this story? The snake. The snake is a symbol of wisdom in the ancient world. And the snake tells them the truth. They should eat from the tree of knowledge. They should have gnosis. And it isn't going to kill them. And he's right. They don't die. And what happens is the God, and it says, let us make man, so there's a plural there. The Gnostic saying the creator God is working with his angels or demons, and they're trying to control life. But when the humans get Gnosis, this is a problem for the original because they don't have it. They don't have Gnosis to begin with. They have the false understanding that they're the reality. And so they're so frightened by humans having this Gnosis, they kick them out and try to control them and try to put them into the world so they'll forget they have Gnosis. And that's the problem with humankind. At least some people have been created with Gnosis because Sophia, in her repentance, says, I'm going to put Gnosis into human life so that they won't be just controlled by the false God. The problem is it's in there, and we as humans have it in it. No, I shouldn't say everybody's. Not everybody has. We'll get to that. There's 3 categories, but there's some people are created with Gnosis. They don't know it usually because the world has drowned it out of them. And so what they need to do is eventually discover it. Well, that's going to be the role of Jesus. So the problem is it's not conquering the problem of sin, it's overcoming the ignorance of the creator God. That's the problem. So there's a whole different way of talking about what is it, how do we get back to the pleroma and become part of this ideal community instead of being in the emptiness of the world that we're living in. Okay, that's the dilemma that they're wrestling with. Okay.
Jim, how did they, I'm gonna use the word ego, because the shadow or the demagogue.
Oh, good, you're my next point. Go ahead.
Okay, well, I'm just curious how they came up with that ego that demagogue had. Where did they come?
Well, I quoted in Isaiah 27:9, is it? I am the only God, there is none beside me. That's in Isaiah.
Yeah.
So they have phrases like that they find in the text would say that's where that God is.
Okay.
Okay, well, all of this is wonderful. It's all mythological speculation and everything else. But now let me go in a different direction for a minute. The psychologist Carl Jung got very much interested in Gnosticism and the whole Gnostic claims because he said what they were discovering was what he was saying was about the whole characteristic of humans living in the world. For Jung, everybody is born with a collective archetypes, male, female, young, old, all kinds of things make up the mind is a blank slate. It's filled with all kinds of images. And out of this comes the creator God, namely the ego. Okay? The ego thinks it's the real self. It thinks it's in charge of making all the decision. It creates the world. But it's not the whole of self. For Jung, there's a deeper dimension, the shadow side, for masculine and feminine sides, deeper kinds of issues that are that come out in dreams and fantasies and things like this. So the problem for human life is thinking the ego, like the creator God, is in charge of everything and making the decisions. And it tends to make very bad decisions in the process. But discovering that there's a deeper side of you doesn't come by studying books or by rational thought. You experience this through neurosis, paralyzed psychological things, saying and doing things that you can't seem to control, having conflicts with family, kids, and so forth. A lot of things tell you you're not in control, and you need to get some help to discover your true self. So part of this whole Jungian psychological sense is at some point the ego, after it has formed enough structure, needs to give way to the deeper dimensions of the self and recognize until it returns back to the deeper dimension of the self, it won't discover who it truly is. So translating the Gnostic speculations into psychological forms was why Jung thought, my gosh, in their mythology and in their structure, that's exactly what I think the whole psychological process is. So he started buying some of the Gnostic texts that were found and sponsoring them so they could be kept in libraries and so forth. So he got very much interested in that, and he began wrestling with that stuff as it was too. So the Gnostic.
When was Jung active?
Say it again.
What time frame?
Jung was from 1900 to about 1960, something like that.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
He was a companion with Freud for a while, then they had a falling out. In any case. So there's been attempts to try to find how in this mythology it has great meaning for human existence and for life and so forth, so on. So the Gnostics then challenged the church fathers who were arguing with continuity. The God of the Old Testament and the God of Jesus are one and the same. For the Gnostics, the God of the Old Testament and the God of Jesus aren't one and the same, they're quite different. And therefore the God of Jesus trumps the other false understanding of God, but the false understanding of God gives us a sense of why the world is so messed up the way it is. Okay? But we have the pleroma, we have all of that. And there, and Sophia in particular, is concerned about what's happening to human life. We're created after the image of the ideal human and the pleroma. But we're all in darkness, we're in emptiness. We've forgotten the fact that some of us belong in the pleroma. So how do we come to do that? And that becomes the structure for how they then begin to wrestle with the Christian faith. Jesus' coming to earth isn't to forgive sins, it's to reveal Gnosis that's inside you. And he does this through his teachings and his activity and his refusal to let the anger of the creative God who persecutes him and crucifies him, to let that be the final answer, and returns to life and goes back to the pleroma from which he came. He comes from the pleroma voluntarily to try to help people understand who they truly are, fights against the creative part of the world that's in darkness, and then returns back to the pleroma and leaves in humanity the teachings and insights that will open them up and tell them who they are, so they too can receive love and forgiveness as they understand themselves, experience gnosis, and become part of the pleroma. Okay? So that's their understanding of what Christianity ought to be. Much different than where the Orthodox Church was going. And it challenged the whole structure of the way in which the church was developing. So you can see the second century, it was a wild kind of discussion. From my point of view, the brightest thinkers in the second century were Gnostics. There were some bright ones in the Orthodox group, but there were not as many. There were at least 10 Gnostic scholars that produced works that wrestled with these questions in one way or another. You got 2 or 3 in the Orthodox tradition that really were doing significant work.
Jim,
Yeah.
you keep using the term pleroma. I must have missed somewhere. I missed.
Yeah. Okay.
What's that? Just the structure?
Well, the word comes from the Gospel of John. Out of the fullness we have received. The word plero means fullness. So it's the fullness of the heavenly realm. And so all of those beings that were generated out of the original God that now make up the community are called the pleroma.
Okay.
That's the heavenly realm.
Okay.
And now it has a
For
limit.
the Gnostics.
Yeah, so, yeah, right. So you have God in the middle, then you have another circle in which the rest of the beings are. That's the pleroma. Outside the pleroma, you have the creation, where the demiurge exists. And the question is, if you don't find yourself, you're destroyed at the end. If you partially find yourself, you may get to the pleroma. You may get to where the demiurge is. And if you find Gnosis, you get to return to the pleroma. So there are different patterns and different things. We'll go into that in more detail.
So how do the Gnostics see evil, or do they see evil?
Yeah, part of the reason that evil is created because of the ignorance of the creator to begin with. He created situations which he thought he was doing a good job, but he was messing things up. And it made all kinds of conflict and power structures and everything else, which were in conflict with one another. So ultimately, the evil is created out of Sophia, out of the shadow that was left behind, in which both you have the creator and the devil figure. Let me see if I can find something here for you.
So this is like the false creator.
Yeah,
And is that the same as logos?
no,
No.
Logos is a part of the pleroma and is that which generates everything that generates out of the Logos. So everything exists, but it doesn't make anything. He generates. The maker is the demiurge. So I'll find it. Now that you're asking me, I will find it. In 2 Corinthians, and I'm not going to find it very quickly, so I'll just tell you. In 2 Corinthians, Paul makes the statement, the God of this world is binding you. Well, the God of this world is not the God of Jesus. And Paul's like, the God of this world is the devil. The Gnostics read that in Paul and saying, yeah, that's right. The God of the created this world isn't the God of. So they read Paul saying, the God of this world, which comes out of Enoch because the fallen angels and everything there, the God of this world is no longer the God of Jesus. It's the creator God who messed everything up. So they read Paul. They also read in 1 Corinthians, they read that those of us who are pranatic, spiritual people who have gnosis, I couldn't teach all of you. Some of you weren't mature enough to get it. So Paul distinguishes between some who don't get it and Gnostics who are spiritual people. So there in 2 Corinthians is the key. That sounds to the Gnostics like he could only tell ordinary people some things, but there were higher things that he could only teach to those who have gnosis. Well, then there's a bunch of secret teachings that come out of Jesus. This goes back to Mark. When Jesus is telling parables in chapter 4 of Mark, he says, to you, the insiders, I've given you the secrets of the kingdom of heaven. To outsiders, I've only told parables. The Gnostics reads Paul, they hear this business in Mark and say, Jesus told secret teachings to his inner disciples. And it's the secret teachings that the Gnostics have. The Orthodox Church is still the immature people that Paul couldn't educate. You can hear the problems here. Yes.
The problem I have with that is that the disciples never seem to get it in any of the stories.
Right, exactly. In Mark's gospel, the disciples are the most ignorant ones in the world. They're perfect examples of ones who don't have gnosis. So they don't get it. Yeah. It's the other gospels try to clean them up, but it's hard to do it. In John, they do better. In John's gospel, the disciples do better than they do in Mark. In any case, the notion that the Gnostics have this wild speculation, they claim goes back to Jesus. So if you're going to be faithful to what's been handed down, yeah, hand down the secret teachings which are now coming out. Don't hand down the orthodox stuff, which is what was given to the immature.
What created evil in the first place?
Well, and the Gnostic claimed
That
the,
the original,
the false
Orthodox,
the false gods created it.
which was what the Orthodox side.
The Orthodox blame it on humans. The sin that they put into the world. So so you can just see the hostility that's going to start happening between the groups because they have quite different points of view about what had happened. But the Gnostic were claiming we are Christians telling you the truth about what Christianity is. The Orthodox, no, we're the Christians and we're telling you what the truth of it is. So there was a discussion and conflict going on. Now, not all the Gnostics agreed, by the way. There were different Gnostic groups too. The most dominant group was by Valentinus. That group became the most dominant group. And they produced much of the writings. We don't have Valentinus was, and what we don't know a lot about him. We have what people said about him. They said he was born in Egypt and he was educated in Alexandria. Well, Alexandria is the center for all wisdom at that time was in Alexandria. They had the library, they had the Greek works, they had even Greek works from India, they had Roman world, they had Egyptian texts, they had all. So Valentinus was educated in Alexandria and was aware of all of these factors in the world. And then he went to Rome about 150 and starts teaching in Rome and starts proclaiming this. And he was working within the church. He wasn't trying to separate or build a different church. He was trying, and he was getting some pretty large audiences when he was speaking. And he thought he was doing so well and he was so committed that he expected to be elected Bishop of Rome, to become Pope. Well, he came in second. They gave it to a guy who faced martyrdom and lived through it. So when he was so disappointed, he broke and started developing his own churches. So suddenly you start getting Gnostic churches created. And they began spreading this. And pretty soon the Gnostic churches were all over the place. Rome, they went out to Spain. They went into Syria. They were they were dominant until all the persecution took place in the 4th century. But it's interesting that some of what they represented goes underneath and becomes part of the mystical tradition. Saint Teresa, Eckhart, a lot of them are picking up insights coming out of the Gnostic tradition, and they're also having problems with the Orthodox Church. The mystics never quite fit in right. Let me give you one more thing that happens. The church now has defined faith as content. When Luther comes along during the Reformation, Luther challenges the notion that faith is content. It's the faith in which we believe. That was the church's point of view. Luther says, no, it should be faith which believes. Faith is an action, an activity of surrendering in fullness to God's reality and experiencing God. It's not content, it's experience. Luther comes up with a notion of understanding that's very similar to the Gnostics, even though it's not quite the same. But for Luther, salvation is by faith alone, not faith as content, but faith as activity and experience. It's the experience of God's reality in your life. That's what saves you for Luther. Well, that's not that far different from what the Gnostics were saying. So if you're Protestant, you're more going to be on the Gnostic side than the Orthodox side. Now, that doesn't quite work that way. In any case, it's interesting that many of the Gnostic ideas start coming out in different direction as time and history comes out. There's obviously a group in the world right now who call themselves Gnostics and have a big library and are writing books and everything else. So it hasn't died out, but it's not the Gnostics of the second century, that's for sure. Well, I've been throwing a lot of stuff. Anybody have comments or questions about any of this stuff? We have 2 more weeks to get more depth out of them. We still got to figure out what kind of things they did in their churches too. That's kind of interesting.
Well, the Orthodox just kept kind of following the structure of the Jewish faith, it seems to me, as far as hierarchy and.
They saw themselves in continuity
Right,
with what they thought of as Judaism.
right.
Judaism isn't one religion either. It's a mixture of a whole lot of different things. So Philo, who was in Alexandria as a Jewish scholar, he was using Plato to reread the Old Testament. Well, that's different than where some of the other rabbis were reading the Old Testament. So Judaism isn't a monolithic religion either. It isn't even today. So they were looking at all kinds of different nuances. So it depended on which Jewish group you're talking about. It just as what kind of Christian group are you talking about? So there was lots of different things going on before historical forces create them to try to create a unity out of it. Yeah.
So the word that keeps coming up for me is dogma. And so I'm thinking the orthodoxy has created the stuff that I would think of as dogma.
Yeah.
You know, but now have the Gnostics, through their thinking process that discarded this dogma, have they created their own dogma?
They don't become a creedal church.
Okay.
That's contrary to where they are. What they're creating, they create ideas and they create things, but what they're up to is to create an experience. Experience is the key.
Okay.
Not the content.
Not the content.
Yeah.
Okay. The dogma.
What their dogmas or their teachings and so forth have the purpose of awakening your gnosis, your knowledge, your own revelation.
Can you get that from dreams?
What?
Can you get that knowledge from dreams?
They did. I don't see anything in the text, but for Jung, you could. And Jung comes in and tries to translate it into psychological language. He sees one of the places where these images come out and the deeper dimensions come out are through dream experiences. That's been my pattern too.
Just in the Catholic faith, even today, if you start to touch on this stuff, you can be bumped out. Like Matthew Fox, I think his
Right.
teachings included a lot
Yeah.
of this. And
Right.
He was thrown out of the priesthood.
That's right. So it was
So
on
the
school.
beat goes on.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you can, it's tolerable, but there's a limit to it. And if you pass the limit, well, they were going to kick Eckhart out too, because he went too far. So the mystics always had problems with orthodoxy. Luther certainly did. He
And the
got,
Orthodoxy doesn't teach them
yeah,
or introduce you.
yeah, they have a rigid understanding of what ought to be within the normal realm, and if you go outside of that, you're in danger. Okay, well, that's probably enough for one day.
Can I leave it on this note? I have been to an ordination for a Gnostic priest in Sedona, Arizona. I have a first cousin who has been ordained as a Gnostic priest. And thank you for this class, because when I went to the thing, you know, I didn't have a clue.
Yeah, I don't blame you.
Yeah. And but yeah, thank you for some insight into my first cousin.
Okay. Okay, well, we'll continue on and we'll be looking at some of the Gnostic texts and what they were saying about, particularly the Gospel of Philip and the Gospel of Truth, two of the big documents of the Valentinian type Christian Gnosticism anyway. Okay.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.